Despite strong warnings from business groups and trade experts, U.S. President Donald Trump last Thursday signed a memorandum that could impose tariffs on up to $60 billion worth of imports from China and restrictions on Chinese investments in the U.S. The announcement is the latest in a series of U.S. trade restrictions, but this time explicitly targeting China. Hours later, China announced a plan to impose tariffs on some $3 billion worth of American imports in response to increased U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum imports announced 2 weeks ago. Meanwhile, the U.S. has also launched a complaint against China at the World Trade Organization last Friday. So what is behind President Trump's determination to start these trade restrictions? How close are we to an all-out trade conflict, and what role, if any, could the WTO play in helping calm the situation? Welcome to a special edition of The Point. I'm Liu Xin, and joining me here in the studio is Pascal Lamy, former Director General of the World Trade Organization. Mr. Lamy, thank you very much for joining us today. So, looking at the situation at this moment, do you think there is a trade war going on between China and the U.S.?
No. I'm not sure of that, no.
Why?
But if I have to bet, I will bet 80% that there will not be a big trade war, and that what the U.S. are after with this big carpet bombing of tariff measures is to open a negotiation.
But
now,
what is that 20% that make you say it is, and what is that 80% that make you say that it is not?
The 20% that make me think it might not be is that I'm not sure Donald Trump, the U.S. president, is rational. So he may want to simply blow up the multilateral trading system, believing that U.S. is the strongest and that we have to go back to the law of the jungle. So if that's the case, then this necessitates a very serious reaction from the rest of WTO members. They need to send very strong signal to the U.S. that they will not accept the multilateral trading system to be blown up by the U.S. I still believe this is a rational offensive, and that they are pushing in order to open a negotiation with China. We know that the U.S. believe that the trade between U.S. and China is not fair. I'm not saying they're right, nor am I saying they are totally wrong, by the way, and they may want to rebalance the system, although there are many reasons to believe that the reason why there is such a trade deficit between U.S. and China does not have to do with trade, but with macroeconomic considerations. So plan A is my 80%. If the U.S. have a problem, let's look at this problem. Others may have problems with the way the WTO works: India, Europe, Japan, Brazil, Africa. Maybe others have a problem. Then you sit around the table, you look at the problems, and you negotiate a deal. That's the plan A. That's the rational, that's the optimistic view. Plan B, which is if the U.S. want to destroy the World Trade Organization, is a different ballgame.
However, it doesn't seem that President Trump has given much hope on talks. I mean, at least we have seen 2 rounds of tariffs being added to imports, first on washing machines and solar panels, and second on steel and aluminum, although the percentage of these imports in the overall U.S. Foreign trade is still relatively slow. But it seems that the signal is very strong. Do you think he is still pressing for negotiations with China?
I think what he did on washing machine and solar panels is a different category. He used a traditional, classical avenue in WTO, which is called anti-dumping. What he's doing with steel and aluminium is very different. The legal base he's using is national security, which is why, by the way, imposing national security restrictions with Canada or European countries who are members of a military alliance with the US makes absolutely no sense. So that's a different category. And on this Chinese 60 billion, what's unclear is whether the US intend to destroy or to use WTO.
Right now, what are the signs you're seeing?
Well, there are signs in both directions.
Signs in both directions.
On the one side, the US are blocking the WTO court. We need new judges. That's a due process, and they block the nomination of new judges. And this leads clogging the WTO dispute settlement. But on the other side, they are taking China to this court, which they are preventing to work. So there is a contradiction, and it's very difficult to interpret things which are moving in so different directions.
Exactly. Let's talk about that, because there are so many things to talk about, you know, all the contradicting signals he's sending. Talking about economic security, however, the reason why they launched this steel and aluminum tariff they cite is national security, and Mr. Wilbur Roth, who is U.S. Secretary of Commerce, says that economic security is a kind of national security, and he used the example of a kind of special alloy, saying only one supplier in the United States is left to provide this kind of alloy, which is very crucial for usage in military vehicle and in satellites. So he says economic security is national security. Do you think this kind of justification hold ground?
If you look at WTO rules, there is a rule that says that you are allowed to obstruct trade for national security reasons, which is, by the way, the reason why the US imposed the trade embargo on Cuba for 50 years. And both are WTO members. This is why there is a dispute between EU and Russia, and Ukraine and Russia, and probably Qatar and its neighbors, whether trade restrictions were justified on national security grounds. So this will go to the WTO court, and the WTO court will appreciate whether or not this rationale is grounded. Now, in the case of Europe, who is part of NATO together with the US, the notion that Europe would not export aluminium to the US to build tanks or satellites for conflict reasons doesn't make sense, which probably, by the way, is the reason why, at the end of the day, European exports of steel and aluminium, for the moment, have been exempted.
Right.
As, by the way, have Canadian, Mexican, and Australian exports been exempted.
So basically, is it true, or can we understand it this way, that he wanted to be a blanket tariff, but basically it's against China because all of the allies have been exempted from this tariff?
That may be an interpretation, although if you look at the numbers, Chinese export to the US on steel and aluminium are today very small, because they've been previously hit by anti-dumping, anti-subsidy, and safeguards. So the stream of trade you are talking about doesn't justify to use such a big hammer for such a small amount.
So what does he really want to do here? Is he just sending another signal? Or is it trying to intimidate, trying to deter? What is he trying to do then, if it is such a small amount of imports being affected? Really?
This is a good question. And we're all looking for rational answers for a man who may not be rational the way we are rational.
Well,
but my answer to your question would be, he wants to be re-elected. He was elected by people, notably in the Midwest, in the Rust Belt, where steel mills had to close because they were not competitive, where coal mines had to close because coal is not competitive anymore. Part of the signals he gave is, I will take care of these people. They are my people, and I send a symbolic signal to them that I care about them. They can count on me. My 35% of the US electorate will remain behind me. So, to put it in a nutshell, a lot of domestic politics. The reality being that if you look at the way globalization has been working for the last 30 years, there have been huge benefits in globalization. There has also been losers. And in countries like the US, who have a weak social security system, and it's very different in Europe, then the balance between winners and losers may be different. Now, is it a good reason to scapegoat China for damage that was done in the US to part of the population because the US domestic system is unable to cope with that? My answer is no. But if you read a bit of human history, you know that scapegoating foreigners is always a good trick in politics.
You said you sympathized with some of US President Donald Trump's complaints about China, although him and his advisors had a medieval view of global trade at odds with the modern reality of global value chains. Could you elaborate?
Well, on the one side, there is a big benefit to trade opening. And to the difference of Mr. Trump and his advisors, I believe opening trade is a win-win game. If you do something better than I do, and I do something better than you do, we need to trade. You will be better off because you will benefit from my know-how. I will be better off because I will benefit from your know-how. So that's my basic view. A number of people in the US now believe that trade opening is a win-lose game. It's something like, you know, I sell pricey, I buy cheap. That's not the way it works in international trade. So we have probably a big difference there in whether or not trade opening is good. I still believe it is good. I'm not saying it's working 100% fine for everybody in North, South, East, West, because trade opening works to create efficiencies because it's painful, it reshuffles production systems, and it's painful because it works. Now, is the US wrong in that China's economy could be more open? No. I believe, and that's the US position, it's also, by the way, the European position, it's also the Chinese position, it's also the Korean position, that given the huge size of China in the world economy today, China's economy should be more open relative to its size and its importance. It has been opening, but very slowly, at least since they joined WTO in 2001, which was the big jump forward. Since then, the pace of trade opening of China has been very slow for a number of reasons which have to do with domestic constraints in China.
Another thing which President Trump and his secretaries have been complaining about is the unbalanced tariffs the United States impose on imports from Europe and from China versus the other way around. For instance, if a European car comes into the United States, they are charged 2.5% tax, whereas US cars will have to be taxed at 10% as this kind of a example. How do you look at that? I mean, of course, this is from the numbers, it does look very unfair, but how do you look at that?
A bit differently. The point which Mr. Trump made to Mrs. Merkel is this system doesn't work because I don't see chevrons in Berlin, whereas I see plenty of Mercedes in New York. Now, this is true. There are plenty of Mercedes in New York, and there are not many chevrons in Berlin. So the fact is right. Now, what's behind the facts? Behind the facts is two things, which he appears to ignore. Number one is that most of the Mercedes you see in New York are produced in the US. They're not imported from Germany, they are produced in the US. Second, true, there is a difference in the car tariff between US and Europe. This does not prevent Japan or Korea to sell millions of cars in Europe. So why do Japan and Korea sell millions of cars in Europe and the US not? Simply not because they have the same tariff, they are competing in the same conditions. It just happens that Japan and Korea produce cars which fit with what the European consumers want, and the US don't. It's a different in style, it's a different in the way you build cars, it's a different in colors, it's a different in shape. Again, Japan, Korea, now China doing extremely well on the European market, US not doing well. Is US different? No.
So what does that say about his way of looking at things? I mean, we've seen a couple of examples so far. How do you characterize his way of saying? He just looks at a few numbers that he wants to see, and then if they are not equal, if 2 and 2 doesn't, add up to 4, he say, this is not right, I want it my way.
I think you have a point there. The way he looks at trade is like in the past, like in a world where the Pharaoh of Egypt and the King of Crete were negotiating treaties of commerce between Egypt, who was exporting things to Crete, and Crete, who was exporting things to Europe. We are today in a totally different world. We are in a world of global supply chains. We are in a world where the import content of your exports is extremely high. We are in a world where if the US president makes imports into the US more expensive, this will damage the competitiveness of the US industry, which is, by the way, one of the reasons why part of the solution to these tensions lies within the WTO and in bilateral discussions or multilateral discussions between China, Europe, and so on with the US. A large part of the answer to your question lies within the US. At the end of the day, my own sense, for what it's worth, is that these measures will cost to the US, and because of that, there will be a pushback from business, probably from the Republican Party and probably from Congress.
I've been talking to former Director General of the World Trade Organization, Mr. Pascal Lamy. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to dig deeper into these questions. Stay with us. Welcome back, and my guest today is Pascal Lamy, former Director General of the World Trade Organization. Mr. Trump has said on various occasions what he thinks about the WTO, and the latest is this: a tremendous amount of money we've paid since the founding of the WTO. It's been a disaster, very unfair to us, meaning the US. The arbitration has been very unfair, and the judging has been very unfair, and knowingly we always have a minority, so it's not fair. Is he being fair for saying that?
No, he's wrong. The WTO overall has been good for the US. By the way, the US have been driving this big movement that led to the creation of GATT and then WTO in 1994. This has accompanied the internationalization of the US economy. When he says that the dispute system is unfair to the US, this is plainly wrong. The numbers say otherwise. In the WTO, you have offensive cases and defensive cases. Offensive is, I'm the US, I take China to the court. Defensive is, I'm China, I'm taken by EU to the court. The US win roughly 80% of their offensive case. They lose roughly 80% of their defensive case, which means, by the way, that when countries launch cases, they are reasonably confident that they will win. This is the same record as EU, the same record as Brazil, the same record as India, the same record as China. So this appreciation is plain wrong. And just look at the numbers. You can find the numbers on the website of WTO and make up your own mind.
What is the way forward then? Because he seems not to be able to change his mind. He stubbornly believes this is at least on the surface, that the WTO is a disaster. You had said that the WTO probably needs to prepare itself for 3 different outcomes, and one of them is the United States being the lonely cowboy, or the WTO being without the United States as a major player, or the WTO has to change itself to suit the need of the United States. Now, which one is more likely in your eyes?
You're right. My own view, for what it's worth, is that we have Plan A and Plan B. Plan A is, let's listen to the problems the US have with the WTO. Others also may have problems. If I'm China or India or Africa, I will also have views that things down there can be improved. So that's Plan A. You have a problem, tell us what your problem is. I will, by the way, tell you what my problem is, and then we can negotiate a package. Now, if that doesn't work, or if the US are after demolishing the system instead of fixing it or improving it, which might be the case given the signal that Mr. Trump says, if after all WTO is such a catastrophe, why remain there? So that's Plan B. Plan B is, if the US are after demolishing the system, blowing it up, then we need a solid coalition between non-US WTO members that will decide that we want to keep a multilateral rules-based system between ourselves. If the US don't want to be there, I mean, it's going to be a big hole. But, after all, exiting the system for the US would also be quite risky, because the moment you're outside the system, like North Korea or like Algeria or like Ethiopia, anybody can do anything he or she wants with your exports.
Right, exactly.
So
what are the negative consequences of Plan B? This
the
needs to
negative
be known.
consequences for the US of Plan B would be that they would lose this insurance policy they have subscribed, like all WTO members, against unfair protectionism.
At this moment, what would the world lose? What would the WTO suffer, however, if the United States is not part of it? Do you think there is some kind of leeway for the WTO really to address the problems that President Trump has been talking about?
The answer to that is yes. Plan A is recognizing that the WTO system can be improved. And I personally believe, and I was the DG of this organization for 8 years, that it can be improved in many directions. But you do that through a negotiation. If the US don't want to negotiate, or if they believe the system is rigged to the point of deserving to be left, they will do what they do with climate change. They will exit the system. They will do what they did with UNESCO. After all, UNESCO works without the US. The Paris Agreement will be implemented without the US. I'm not saying this is the way forward. This is a fallback position. This is Plan B, not Plan A. But if necessary, they have to understand that others will keep the benefits of the system for themselves.
If there is a trade war, who's going to suffer the most, you think?
I think we will all suffer. This view that the US president has expressed, that if there's a trade war, they are the winners because they have a huge trade deficit, in my view, doesn't make sense. Who today is the loser if washing machines are more expensive in the US? Poor people. Who buys low-cost washing machines which are not produced anymore in the US? Not rich people, not middle-class people, poor people. The fact that China and many other Asian countries succeed in producing low-cost manufacturing devices is something that benefited to the poor working class in the US. So at the end of the day, international trade is a system where efficiencies are increased, and if I have a comparative advantage in producing low-cost washing machines, which probably are lower quality than high-cost washing machines, that's the way it works.
But how do you look at the latest, the 301 section of the Trade Act, where they're targeting all the high-end qualities coming from China? Do you see the rationale behind that?
The rationale they use, and I have to take it as they say it is that in imposing technology transfers to American companies operating in China, the US are breaking the rules of WTO on intellectual property. That's the basic reasoning. Now,
you mean the Chinese are breaking the rules?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's their case. And by the way, it is true, and we know that in Europe also, that in many cases, establishing a manufacturing plant in China in the past has been allowed for the price of technology transfers. There is a sort of deal. Chinese market is getting big and nice. You want to come in China? Fine, but then you have to pay.
So that was the past. How do you see the situation nowadays, according to your knowledge?
From what I know from European companies, it still is the case. Now, then the question is whether this behavior breaches China's obligations as per the intellectual property regulation in WTO. Whether it's the case or not for me to appreciate. I'm not a trade lawyer, not like many trade negotiators.
Who can decide?
The WTO court will decide whether or not, and this is why US has taken China to the WTO court.
But now he's blocking the system, so who can decide? They want to be their own referee.
You are correct. There is a contradiction between blocking the functioning of the court in WTO and taking China to the court, which says that there may be a tactical position at some stage. You're right, these things do not look logical. Sometimes happens with the US president.
What's the way out? 20 seconds, please.
Way out is first negotiation. Sit around the table, look at where there is a problem. I'm saying, like many others, the WTO system can be improved and should be improved. The question is whether you do that by power games or whether you do that by playing by the rules. I think Europe and China, and I know a bit of both, will play by the rules. Whether the US play by the rules or not remains to be seen.
Thank you very much, Pascal Lamy, former Director General of the World Trade Organization. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.